Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents How to Think Like Shakespeare, Lessons from a Renaissance Education, by Scott Newstok, narrated by Gabriel Vaughan. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to illustrations, figures, and images present in the print and e-book formats of this book. Has he any brains? Hath he any thinking? Sure they sleep, he hath no use of them. William Shakespeare, The Merry Wives of Windsor. What's past is prologue. Shakespeare almost everywhere manifests a perfect knowledge in the anatomy of the human mind. Elizabeth Griffith, The Morality of Shakespeare's Drama Illustrated, 1775. In this book of short, deliberately short, chapters, I explore what seem to me to be the key aspects of thinking and how to hone them. As both a teacher and a parent of school-age children, I've become dismayed by the way we think of thinking. While dismay first animated my writing, I'm hopeful that Shakespearean habits of mind can help us hold a mirror up to current dogma. Anxiety about education suffuses our moment. What's the purpose of education? Who gets access to it? When and where should it take place? How can we measure it? Will it get us a job? And is it even worth it when it's both expensive and time-consuming? Our anxieties derive from many urgent sources and surge along many rivulets. But underlying them all lies a worrisome muddle about what we even mean by education. My conviction is that education must be about thinking, not training a set of specific skills. Education isn't merely accumulating data. Machines can memorize far more, and far less fallibly, than humans. Albert Einstein: the value of an education is not the learning of many facts, but the training of the mind to think something that cannot be learned from textbooks. Nor is education merely implementing formulas. Machines can execute far more complex algorithms, and at speeds no human can aspire to. Niels Bohr: no, you are not thinking, you are just being logical. Thinking, that elusive yet crucial activity, is different from these. And if humanity has a killer app, this is it. Conversely, the failure to cultivate thinking is a potential killer. Faced with existential crises in the environment, human migration, creeping authoritarianism, and the specter of artificial intelligence, a world without a broadly disseminated capacity for thinking is severely exposed. Who better embodies a fully deployed mind than William Shakespeare, whom we can almost watch at the task of thinking? Hence the aim of How to Think Like Shakespeare. It seeks to offer not only an exploration of thinking, but an enactment of it, for joy's soul lies in the doing. And because the educational assumptions that shaped Shakespeare were at odds with our own, this book explores those assumptions too. Now, building a bridge to the 16th century must seem a perverse prescription for today's ills. If you had to be at your desk by 6 in the morning, you too would be creeping like snail, unwillingly to school. Raise your hand if you'd like to be beaten for tardiness. What, no takers? Okay, how about translating Latin? For almost 12 hours a day, for 6 days a week, with no summer vacations? No wonder that when school broke up, you'd hurry towards your home. This education was nasty, brutish, and long. Indeed, it was scorned by Shakespeare himself. Whether it's the huffing Holofernes, the garrulous Gerald, or the schoolmaster Hugh Evans, whose monotone repetition of William, William anticipates Ben Stein's Bueller, Bueller, Shakespearean teachers come off as domineering pedants, overstuffed with bookish theoric. Even Prospero faults himself for loving the liberal arts so much that he neglected worldly ends. You'd have a hard time designing a system more unlike our own student-centered, present-focused, STEM-driven schools. Moreover, the 16th century exclusion of girls, the poor, and cultural minorities affronts our conviction that truth must be common to all. We do not want art for a few, any more than education for a few or freedom for a few. Just to be clear, I'm not proposing that we reinstate corporal punishment, tedious rote memorization, or schools that exclude anyone. Thinking is the common property of all. Yet it's blinkered to dismiss Shakespeare's instruction as nothing but oppressive. Thinkers trained in this unyielding system went on to generate world-shifting insights, founding forms of knowledge, indeed, the scientific method itself, that continue to shape our lives. An apparently inflexible program of study induced liberated thinking, and we're far from immune from our own inflexible idols. Our educational system is too often rigid where it should be yielding, and lax where it should be rigid. Thinking like Shakespeare untangles a host of today's confused, let's be blunt, just plain wrong, educational binaries. We now act as if work precludes play, imitation impedes creativity, tradition stifles autonomy, constraint limits innovation, discipline somehow contradicts freedom, engagement with what is past and foreign occludes what is present and native. Shakespeare's era delighted in exposing these purported dilemmas as false. Play emerges through work, creativity through imitation, autonomy through tradition, innovation through constraints, freedom through discipline. I stand with the contrarian view that to be a political progressive, one needs to be an educational conservative. Preserving the seeds of time enriches the present. Call this heirloom education. For out of old fields, as people say, comes all this new grain from year to year, and out of old books in good faith comes all this new knowledge that people learn. Each of the following 14 chapters weighs lessons from Shakespeare's world and work, aligns them with modern-day analogues, and suggests opportunities for further reading. Distilled here are the ingredients of this manner of thinking, a kind of loose recipe for cooking it up. Because the investigation of words is the beginning of education, we'll often pause to ponder the history of a key term, in hopes of amending the impoverished way we've come to talk about one of the richest human endeavors. A more vibrant vocabulary could help make a better platform of teaching, to invoke one 17th century educator's evocative phrase. A platform ought to raise us up, not just sell us stuff. And here I build a platform, and live upon it, and think my thoughts, and aim high. Throughout this book, I've stitched together an almost endless collection of scattered thoughts and observations into a kind of patchwork, or cento, of passages that have inspired me. Be forewarned, quotations come swift as thought, as Homer used to say. I do this precisely because thinking like Shakespeare means thinking with each other's harvest, and I'm eager for this eclectic chorus of voices to be the cause that wit is in others. Little that I say here is new, but if it's true that there is nothing worth thinking but it has been thought before, then it's also true that we must only try to think it again, and not just think, but restate for our moment. We have now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty. The chapters return to recurrent notions, trusting that thought does not progress in a single direction. Instead, the moments are interwoven as in a carpet. Anything more direct would betray our myriad-minded Shakespeare. The reason the chapters are no more than 14? To paraphrase King Lear, because they are not 15. Act 1, Scene 5, line 31. In other words, it's pretty arbitrary. But in the spirit of the Renaissance fascination with numerical lore, let's play out a few happy congruences. Fortuitously, 14 aligns with the number of lines in a sonnet, the stages in the educational progymnasmata, and the U.S. constitutional amendment guaranteeing citizenship. 14 years is around the age when a student left grammar school, after copying good models, and building up a storehouse of knowledge. It was the age to enter an apprenticeship and start a career. For women in particular, the age stood as benchmark for maturity. As for Juliet, who we're reminded hath not seen the change of 14 years, or in the case of Pericles' 14 years delayed reunion with his daughter Marina. The Greek mathematician Archimedes invented a puzzle called ostomachion, which sharpened your memory while you rearranged its 14 pieces into patterns of infinite variety. And many religious traditions find the number significant. Jains believe in 14 levels of spiritual development. Catholics observe 14 stations of the cross. The Passover Seder follows 14 steps. More poignantly, the Egyptian god Osiris was said to have been cut into 14 pieces by his murderous brother Set, who scattered the bits in all directions. John Milton transformed this mythological butchery into a parable about the laborious process of reconstructing thought. From that time ever since, the sad friends of truth, such as durst appear, imitating the careful search that Isis made for the mangled body of Osiris, went up and down, gathering up limb by limb, still as they could find them. Milton concedes, "We have not yet found them all, nor ever shall do." That's all the more reason to think hard about thinking. 1. Of thinking. "I will not cease from mental fight," Blake wrote. Mental fight means thinking against the current, not with it. Virginia Woolf, Thoughts on Peace in an Air Raid, 1940. Thinking's tough. We all want shortcuts. You probably picked this book because you thought it would give you shortcuts. Thinking taxes us, because our brains are designed not for thought, but for the avoidance of thought. No wonder we dodge it. But don't take my word for it. Nothing pains some people more than having to think. Martin Luther King, Jr., 1963. Most people would die sooner than think. In fact, they do so. Bertrand Russell, 1925. Remember how many pass their whole lives and hardly once think, and never learn themselves to think. Walt Whitman, 1855. What is the hardest task in the world? To think. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1841. The very painful effort of really thinking. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1811. A provision of endless apparatus, a bustle of infinite enquiry and research, or even the mere mechanical labor of copying may be employed to evade and shuffle off real labor, the real labor of thinking. Sir Joshua Reynolds, 1784. Thinking about thinking might be easier to caricature than to capture, whether in iconic images of Rodin's Thinker or Hamlet holding Yorick's skull. The novelist William Golding relates how he was chastised as a delinquent student. "Don't you ever think at all?" "No, I didn't think, wasn't thinking, couldn't think. I was simply waiting in anguish for the interview to stop." "Then you'd better learn, hadn't you?" On one occasion the headmaster leapt to his feet, reached up and plunked Rodin's masterpiece on the desk before me. That's what a man looks like when he's really thinking. I surveyed the gentleman without interest or comprehension. Lewis Carroll mocks the faith that a mere pose will induce insight, when the dodo can't answer a question. Without a great deal of thought, It stood for a long time with one finger pressed upon its forehead, the position in which you usually see Shakespeare in the pictures of him, while the rest waited in silence. Even Plato failed to settle upon one apt image for thinking, calling forth in turn the sting of a gadfly, the midwifing of a notion, the paralysis induced by an electric ray, an inward conversation, a sudden invisible wind. Yet like the famous judge faced with obscenity, we claim to know thinking when we see it, despite the difficulty of definition. And if we believe cultivating it is a good thing, then we are often perverse. We've imposed educational programs that kill the capacity to think independently, or even the desire to do so. While we point to thinkers, Leonardo, Galileo, Newton, Darwin, Curie, who model the disciplined, independent, questing intellect we claim to revere, we enforce systems ensuring that our own young people could never emulate them. Shakespeare earned his place in our pantheon of minds by staging thought in action. Across his works, terms like think, thinking, or thought outnumber feel, feeling, or felt by a nearly 10-to-1 ratio. He raises ideas into a quasi-physical reality, vivifying their dynamic power as a palpable force. When staging thinking, Shakespeare adopts images from a craft workshop, whether as thoughts whirled like a potter's wheel, or the quick forge and working house of thought, as if one were hammering mental metal on an anvil. He even coins an adjective for thinking, forgative. Forgative looks as though it ought to mean something like, well, forgetful, but the emphasis is instead on the kinetic activity in that root, forge, to make or grasp. We must be ready to fly like thought, to catch it in the act, for nimble thought can jump both sea and land. When Helen Keller placed her hands on Merce Cunningham to feel him leap, she marveled, "How like thought, how like the mind it is." As Shakespeare's contemporary Michel de Montaigne put it, thinking about thinking is a thorny undertaking, and more so than it seems, to follow a movement so wandering as that of our mind. Here's a recent example of not thinking about Shakespearean thinking. Ken Robinson's Do Schools Kill Creativity is a popular TED Talk with more than 60 million views. The title primes your answer. Yes, of course schools kill creativity. And Robinson's pitch follows his self-confirming template. Schools are hierarchical, industrialist, outdated. This is a crisis, crime, catastrophe, and the answer is creativity, innovation, technology. Yet his diagnoses and his prescriptions don't line up, right from his disarming opening joke. You don't think of Shakespeare being a child, do you? Shakespeare being 7? I never thought of it. I mean, he was 7 at some point. He was in somebody's English class, wasn't he? How annoying would that be? Must try harder. Sir Ken gets the laughs, but Shakespeare never studied in an English class. No such class would exist until centuries after his time. Instead, his Stratford Grammar School was conducted in Latin, and his regimented Latin curriculum proved to be the crucible for his creative achievement in English. Robinson is right about one thing. Shakespeare would have been enrolled at around the age of 7, long considered a pivotal developmental stage for children, as lasting patterns of thinking take hold. Aristotle held that children should leave home and enter school when they turned 7. At 7, medieval pages would enter the household of a knight. It's the age that Michael Apted's 7 Up documentary commences its remarkable chronicle of the life-determining effects of social class, summoning the motto attributed to Loyola, "Give me the child for the first 7 years, and I will give you the man." In 2016, I was invited to address my college's incoming students. My summer was consumed with fretting that the last thing they'd want to hear would be a lecture from some 43-year-old white man. Indeed, my micro-demographic had just become a reverse meme. An irritated millennial journalist had replaced the word millennials in magazine headlines with the phrase 43-year-old white men, exposing fatuous generational generalizations. How 43-year-old white men are ruining the workforce. Why are so many 43-year-old white men having zero sex? The hot new 43-year-old white men trend is hating 43-year-old white men. And my favorite, Martha Stewart still confused about what 43-year-old white men are exactly. So I was cautious about being the cranky old prof hectoring the youth. But it dawned on me. These students would have been 7 years old just around the moment that our obsession with shallow forms of evaluation was kicking into high gear. Their cohort was the first to have been marched through their entire primary and secondary schooling under a testing-obsessed regime. While I concentrate here on the American system, this is a global phenomenon, as fellow teachers from South Korea to Kurdistan have recounted to me. In December 2001, just as I was stumbling to the close of my first semester of full-time teaching, the No Child Left Behind Act passed Congress with support from both parties as well as educational entrepreneurs, yet with scant input from actual teachers. We were promised the act would close the achievement gap to make all students proficient in reading and math by the year 2014. Perversely, its so-called skills-driven focus on literacy and numeracy did not lead to greater literacy and numeracy. Instead, the achievement gap widened as draconian reforms sapped scarce time and resources from course offerings in art, drama, music, history, languages, and even the sciences. Teachers' autonomy was eroded by external curricular mandates, often directed by corporate vendors eager to advance Bill Gates's vision of standardizing education as if it were an electrical plug or railroad width. Seek. This disempowerment of teachers makes them little more than paraprofessionals. They're present not to model thinking, just to help the machine hoover up a child's data exhaust and monitor learnification. Yet the wealthier you are, the more likely you will be to insist that your child's school, nanny, or other caretakers not expose them to attention-splintering digital fora. John Dewey's exhortation still ought to ring true. What the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all of its children. Any other ideal for our schools is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. Worse, high-stakes exams narrowed not only what's taught, but how it's taught. The open-ended joy of reading has too often withered to a soulless dissection of content without context. The joy of mathematics to arbitrary exercises, drained of the delightful pattern-making that generates conjecture in the first place. We've forgotten Mark Twain's insight. Intellectual work is misnamed. It is a pleasure, a dissipation, and its own highest reward. I was a math geek before I finally determined to study literature. I'll never forget how my college calculus professor, renowned for his intimidating personality, would stop in the midst of a proof. He'd step back from the chalkboard. He'd stare and ponder. Look at that. Do you see that? We could have done this proof in 11 steps, but we found a more elegant way. We got there in just 7. That's beautiful. His awe at the grace-filled solution was contagious. A mathematician, like a painter or a poet, is a maker of patterns. All intellectual pursuits are more qualitative than any bubble sheet can ever gauge. We ought not to be surprised that in recent decades children have become less emotionally expressive, less energetic, less talkative and verbally expressive, less humorous, less imaginative, less unconventional, less lively and passionate, less perceptive, less apt to connect seemingly irrelevant things, less synthesizing, and less likely to see things from a different angle. This is the real creativity killer. Let's return now to 7-year-old Shakespeare and consider not how annoying he might have been to his instructor, but rather how we might reclaim some of the best aspects of his education. Now, I know what you're thinking. Of course, a Shakespeare professor would say that. We all tend to think the thing that we do is right. As in Alexander Pope's observation, "'Tis with our judgments as our watches none go just alike, yet each believes his own." Shakespeare's contemporary Philip Sidney jested that all people praise their own line of work as essential. Before he defends his own hobby horse, poetry, Sidney recounts another man's affection for horsemanship. He exercised his speech in the praise of his faculty. He said soldiers were the noblest estate of mankind, and horsemen the noblest of soldiers, and that no earthly thing bred such wonder to a prince as to be a good horseman. He nearly persuaded me to have wished myself a horse. I don't wish you were a horse, or even another Shakespeare, who will never be made by the study of Shakespeare. Yet Shakespeare was once 7. He did have teachers, and they taught him something about thinking. In turn, our own power of understanding can expand and become conscious of itself as we watch it at work in Shakespeare. I'm not talking about what Shakespeare thought. Every word on stage is said through the voice of a character, so wrenching quotations out of context won't reveal how he felt about law or love or leadership. This hasn't prevented management consultants from claiming that they can derive lessons from the plays. Here's a familiar example. "This above all to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man." One book glosses these lines thus: "Trust and integrity are critical in business. Once one's reputation for integrity is lost, one's effectiveness is lost." The blandness is obvious, and I have to confess, I'm guilty of this kind of misguided projection. My high school yearbook from 3 decades ago includes my pimpled portrait, nerdy activities, and classmates' scribbles. For my motto, I selected this same passage from Hamlet, and attributed those words to Shakespeare. But the quotation comes from a sententious father reciting a cascade of tepid proverbs to his departing son. So what Shakespeare said, here a trite truism, is far less suggestive than how it was said, through the voice of a toadying functionary. This character satirizes moral entrepreneurship. Look at the peculiar way this speech was first printed in 1603. Why does the left margin insert a series of quotation marks? The punctuation flags you to stop, look, notice these sententious phrases. Transcribe them in your commonplace book. Here you might jot down new words, favorite phrases, ideas caught in passing. Anything that your memory cannot contain, commit to these waste blanks. Sonnet 77. Thomas Hobbes always carried a notebook in his pocket, and as soon as a notion darted, he presently entered it into his book. Or else he should perhaps have lost it. In such a notebook, an aspiring young thinker achieves choice thoughts for later reflection and eventual action. According to one Renaissance treatise, it is singular good to have some pretty sprinkled judgment in the commonplaces and practices of all the liberal sciences, chopped up in hotch-pot together, out of the which we may still help ourselves in talk. By compiling commonplace thoughts of others, we can better shape our own words to become, well, less commonplace. Books about what Shakespeare thought about love also to strip quotations of their situational meaning. Sonnets are often contorted to fit sexual conventions. You might hear Sonnet 18 or 116 recited at a wedding between a man and a woman. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? thou art more lovely and more temperate. Or, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds. Yet therein the voice of an older man addressing his young...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?